A kingdom in peril. A young hero with the courage to try and save it. His journey will be a long and dangerous one. In order to succeed, he must traverse great distances and time itself. The hero of legend has finally arrived. This is Ocarina of Time, and this is why we love it. Growing up in the 8-bit and 16-bit age of gaming was an exercise in imagination. The games were absolutely incredible, and some, as we mentioned before with Super Metroid, were as immersive as they come. But beyond the classics, the overall experience could, at times, require a bit of work on the part of the player to really put them in that world. As beautiful as some of the games were during this time, they simply didn't look like real life. They didn't feel like real worlds. The plot of a game outside of RPGs was usually relegated to 1 or 2 cutscenes at the beginning and end of a game. The arcade style of home console games was very much still the norm. Then, 3D games started to emerge. The rise of 3D gaming was a big deal. I mean a huge deal, when I was a kid. Sure, looking back at many of the first 3D games now, they weren't exactly pretty. So many polygons. But much like the technological jump from the 8 to 16-bit era, we didn't really know things could get any better just yet. So even with the rudimentary 3D of the PlayStation and Nintendo 64, our minds were blown. Mario 64 led the charge into this brave new world and showed just how good 3D gaming could be. But much like the previous entries in the Mario franchise, the story was, well, lacking. We had yet to have that cinematic experience in a video game. There wasn't much emphasis on storytelling in games outside RPGs because the medium didn't really lend itself to telling stories. That was until 3D. Enter The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. The first time I played this game was a revelation. It was a turning point in my gaming life. I had never seen such an expansive world. It felt so alive. There were people in this world, and it felt like they were really living in it. Of course, the concept of towns and cities was nothing new to RPGs, but seeing it all in a 3-dimensional space really released me into this world unlike any other game had done before it. It felt as if even when I wasn't in Kakariko Village, that the residents were going on about their lives. This, of course, was not the case, but it felt that way for the first time in my gaming life. The kingdom, at least for the time, felt huge, so big that it was best traversed by horseback. Growing up, the Zelda franchise had produced some of my favorite games. One of my first great experiences in gaming was exploring Hyrule on the original Nintendo. And Link to the Past made my little mind explode with its atmosphere and gameplay. But Ocarina of Time brought the exploration, atmosphere, and gameplay elements I loved into a world that looked just a bit more like mine, and that immersion felt incredible. It was that missing piece, that connection, that I hadn't felt before. I always had to use my imagination in the earlier eras of gaming to really feel the grand scale of a game. But with Ocarina, there it was in front of me. Of course, I would come to appreciate the older eras and what they did with so little processing power as an adult. But as a child, once I saw Ocarina of Time, I thought I would never touch my Super Nintendo again. It wasn't just the jump to 3D that took me to a completely different place with Ocarina. Like I said, Mario 64 had paved the way for 3D gaming 2 years prior. It was the cinematic elements of Ocarina that felt new and refreshing. A jump into the wide expanse of the future. And it was bright. The opening of Ocarina of Time sets the tone for the game. A very brief, and by today's standard, basic dream sequence cutscene. I mean, just look at Ganondorf's face. What's that face supposed to be expressing? Watching it today, it doesn't exactly hold the same weight, but neither does The Matrix. For the era that it was in, This opening cinematic was beyond belief. I had never played a game that attempted anything like it, and I had been battling Ganon and his forces for years on the previous consoles. To see all those key elements, the Triforce, Zelda, Ganon, Link himself, flash before my eyes in what felt like a movie scene was the most extraordinary way that Ocarina could have possibly started. I was hooked right then and there. Zelda was in trouble and I needed to save her, even if I was just a little boy. A feeling that in the 2D Zelda games wasn't really that apparent. Sure, I was aware that Link was just a child in the original Zelda games, but the sense of scale and the real implications that he was a child were lost in the previous entries. Link was just a slightly smaller sprite than the adult characters. Ocarina of Time is the first game in the Zelda series that really makes you feel like Link is just a kid. He's not a strong and fearless warrior. Not yet, at least. He's a young boy, just starting out in his journey. That opening cutscene demonstrated this idea perfectly. A very young-looking Link is standing there in front of a huge castle gate in a storm. He looks helpless and very much out of his element. The camera pans upward, giving us a sense of scale. Ganondorf not only towers over him, but is riding a dark horse that even further serves to make Link seem like an absolutely insignificant element of this story. What could this boy possibly do against the might of the evil Ganondorf? This is a story of triumphing against impossible odds, and the design of the game keeps that theme running throughout. When you're exploring dungeons as young Link, it actually feels like a dangerous place to be, and you feel so out of place. Giant spiders, bats, the dungeons are the stuff of nightmares. It's not discussed enough just how dangerous Ocarina feels when you're first starting the game. You feel helpless but courageous. You know you're going to get strong enough to fight Ganondorf by the end. But with the design of the environments and young Link, you get the sense that this journey to greatness is going to take some time. Think about young Link's battle cry. It's one of the most iconic noises in gaming. But does that sound like a real threat to you? If you opened up your closet in the middle of the night and heard that sound, would you cower in fear? Young Link sounds like a puppy. And because we're thrown into dungeons that immediately feel threatening even to an adult, the sense that Link is really this great hero cannot be understated. It was masterful work by Miyamoto and his team. But what really put this game over the top, the element that made this tale feel more epic than anything before it? The music. Oh my god, the music. The Zelda franchise had always been known for its music. Even in the 8 and 16-bit eras, beautifully composed themes had always set the tone for a Zelda game. But with a bump up to a more powerful system, the music compositions were scaled up as well. Every single area of the game, every single cutscene, even the little songs we play on our ocarina, every one of them was a classic. To this day, I still find myself whistling the Lost Woods theme. The title screen music, the boss music, the music when you find an item. There are just so many songs that fit perfectly into each individual situation. And combined with all the other elements mentioned earlier, really just puts you in the middle of the most epic story my young mind could imagine. The feel of this game cannot be understated because it truly is the feel that makes this game the iconic classic that it is. Of course, that's not to say the gameplay wasn't on a grand scale as well, because it absolutely was. Once the awe of beauty settles in, the gameplay carries Ocarina through its 30-hour runtime. Let's be honest, pretty games are pretty, but if they're not fun, I don't care how beautiful it looks, I'm not going to be spending much time with it. Ocarina took the gameplay elements we were all now so familiar with from the previous games in the franchise and perfectly translated them into a 3D space. Much like the jump from Mario from 2D platforming to 3D in Mario 64, Zelda took the idea of dungeon exploration into a 3D space and made it feel familiar yet new all at the same time. Moving through dungeons and having to think about vertical space as opposed to a flat plane was definitely a challenge as a young gamer. I think I spent hours on the Deku Tree just figuring out that I could light spiderwebs on fire with my torch. But once I became acclimated to the new style of play, it felt like I was playing a classic Zelda adventure, just on a far grander scale than possible in the past. Navigating the dungeon while looking for key items to progress, finding secrets, figuring out how to get a door to open, gaining a new weapon or tool to take on the dungeon's boss. All the elements that were present in it just felt so good. The new 3D combat element felt great too. Locking onto enemies put our focus on the battle, and for the time, fighting with a sword had never felt so actual. As you and the enemy circle each other, it felt like a chess match. Sure, 3D combat has come a long way since Ocarina, but it was revolutionary and added to the sense of epicness in this game. Every single element of this game makes you feel like you're living through this epic tale passed down from generation to generation. I mean, how many times did you run around with toy swords as a kid pretending you were slaying monsters? And now, in Ocarina, you were playing those fantasies out in a game on a scale that had never been done before. And to me, that is the biggest takeaway from The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. This game made me feel like I was on an incredible adventure. It's as simple as that. It spans time. It spans a huge kingdom. It was a coming-of-age story, something we all went through. Being too small and too insignificant to make a difference in our world, and then finally rising up to become the people we always thought we would be. Ocarina is a classic tale that has been done before and since. But this was one of the first times it felt like we had actually experienced it ourselves. The look, the feel, the music, the gameplay. All the elements of this game blended together perfectly to deliver an experience. And for many people, Ocarina is what ushered in the era of gaming we still have to this day. The immersive worlds of GTA 5 and Skyrim are all children of Ocarina. And in our modern era of gaming, where grand adventures are a dime a dozen, in our modern era of the internet, where everybody has seen and done everything that could possibly be done, we sometimes forget just how big an impact Ocarina had when it was released in 1998. The closest equivalent in modern times would be the rise of virtual reality gaming. The sense of awe that people get the first time they put on a VR headset and are transported to a new world is the same feeling many of us got when we first played Ocarina. It was a pioneer. It set the tone for future games. Is it perfect? No. But that's not the point. That's not its significance. We often look very fondly today on 16-bit games as the pinnacle of game design. These masterpieces like Super Metroid, Super Mario World, and Link to the Past are still held in reverence. But those are games at the tail end of an era. The 2D game had been honed down to finely tuned perfection, and those games are a product of the hundreds of trials and failures that came before them. Ocarina was ushering in a completely new era. Nobody had done what Ocarina was attempting, not on that scale. It changed the gaming landscape completely. It gave rise to the cinematic feel that games have today, to the immersive worlds we love to get lost in for hours and hours. Ocarina of Time made a huge impact on the gaming industry that can still be felt and seen to this very day. It's beautiful. It feels amazing. It put us in a completely new world. The hero of legend had finally arrived. And that is why we love The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. If you like this channel and the content that we're putting out, please consider becoming one of our patrons. Super Metroid begins when you, Samus Aran, a stoic, space bounty hunter and one of the coolest characters ever, think Boba Fett if he didn't suck at everything, receives a distress signal from the Ceres space colony.